Yeah.
Welcome to the BMI Podcast, guys.
Welcome.
Today we done an hour about religion before this, so we're going to have to do a quick one on Hyrox today.
Yes,
So,
it's a natural progression.
yeah, so it's good. I enjoyed this because I get 2 episodes out of the one visit, which is always a 2 for 1.
Hard.
But we're going to be talking about Hyrox nutrition today. So we did an episode on Hyrox the other day, just about the whole event itself. Mm-hmm. But you being a nutritionist and actually having a lot of clients that have competed in that Hyrox that just happened in Auckland.
Yep.
It would be really interesting to see the different needs and wants for, I guess, getting your nutrition sorted while trying to prep for a Hyrox.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, for anyone who hasn't listened to the Hyrox episode, go back and listen to that one, because it'll kind of give you an overview of, again, like what you said, like what sport. Hyrox is and the sport and how it's kind of come to be. As a brief, it's essentially 8 intervals of a 1K run, undulating between different exercises. So rowing, ski erg, wall balls, sled push-pull, lunges, farmer's carry. And so it's 8 stations, 8 runs in between each of those stations. So 8Ks in total. And so, roughly the duration of the event will take anywhere between, the pros at the moment are kind of doing it just under an hour. So let's say around 55 minutes, all the way up to 1.5 to potentially 2 hours for people that are kind of just doing it for the first time. So it's quite a range in terms of like just the time that people are going to be doing it for, but very similar, I think, to say a half marathon, or even a 10 or a 15K. You'll have some people that are doing a half marathon in close to an hour, and then you'll have some people doing it in 1.5 to 2.5 hours. So it's very similar to some of those races. And how I would think about fueling it is actually from the time that you expect it to take you, rather than necessarily the event itself. So rather than thinking, okay, well, this is an 8K run or 8 times 1K run with a few exercises in between, think of it in you'll be moving for X period of time. So which you'll have an understanding of as you're going through that training. So I'm picking, if you're thinking or you're signing up to a Hyrox race, you kind of have an understanding of what that process looks like. You might have done a couple of sims or a couple of trial runs through of the whole thing, or at least half of it, just to kind of get a grip of your fitness level. And based on that, you'll have a time that you'll think that it's going to take for you to complete. And when it comes to fueling, I would be thinking about the time that it's going to take to complete, over necessarily just the exercises itself. Yeah,
well, it's funny you mentioned time, because Tia Claire Toomey, the CrossFit champion, just bet the world record for the women's doubles.
Oh, she did?
So she's been doing it for all of 3 weeks, but she is one of the fittest women of all time. Yeah. And 100%. So she's been focusing on it the last, because I think she did the Melbourne.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, last year or something like that.
Yeah,
or maybe start of the year.
Yes.
Maybe start of the year.
End of last year.
Yeah. So she did Melbourne and placed 3rd, and then she's like, she's a true competitor. Eh? She's just like, fuck, I got 3rd. Yeah. So then she went and so she's qualified for the Worlds now. Yep. So she's still wanting to compete in CrossFit, but then also is training for Hyrox. So it'll be interesting to see how because she's shrunk down a bit, because it's mainly strength based with the CrossFit. Yep. But she's doing a lot of running now, and her running's tidied up a lot. And she was already one of the better runners of CrossFit too, which
CrossFit,
is
for sure. Yeah, I mean it will be interesting to see how a lot of the CrossFit athletes kind of transition, because at the moment, I think I was mentioning last time, the sport is kind of dominated by a lot of rowers, triathletes, like typical endurance people. And I mean, it'll be interesting to see how quickly the general physique of the sport changes, because that typically shows you what type, like what you're saying about the trail run. Like you can pick the runners, you can pick the weightlifters and things like that. It'll be interesting to see whether or not the Hyrox look shifts over the next 3 to 5 years.
I think it will. I think it will. Yeah. So like, tell us a bit about, so, you were talking about time, I guess time on feet, and explain that to the listeners, like what what do you mean by that? Because this also applies for running. Like we've talked about this in previous podcasts. It's fueling your energy expenditures, right? Like it's time on your feet.
Yep. So when
we'll talk about that, and then we'll go to like leading up prep would be good one to go to after that.
So when you look for essentially the amount of time that you're racing for, that essentially gives you a dictate on the amount of energy that is going to be expended over that period of time, right? So if you're working for, I don't know, take powerlifting because it's probably the opposite end of the spectrum. If you take powerlifting, you'll do one lift which will take you a maximum of about 5 seconds, right? Down and press. So that's a 5-second effort. When you're competing, it's about 5 seconds. Granted, during powerlifting, you have to do that repeatedly, so it's multiple 5-second efforts, but there's a gap in between, right? You have a rest between having to do those efforts. And so everything in that sense is all about putting maximum amount of energy into that 1 5-second block. Strength end of the spectrum. Other end of the spectrum being endurance, and this is where Hyrox is kind of fitting into an endurance event. I would view it as an endurance event rather than a strength event. You're going to be working not at maximal capacity in the sense of I'm going to lift as much as I can one time in 5 seconds, but I'm going to be working at sub-maximal capacity, so I can do this, but how long can I last for? And so now you're going to take, like I said, anywhere between 60 and 90 minutes. Typically speaking, the longer you work for, the more energy that's going to be required, right? So if you're working for 5 seconds, it's going to take less energy to move your body for 5 seconds, even though you're putting everything into that, than what it is to move for an hour and a half, because time.
Yeah.
So once you've broken that down and you know how long you're working for, then that dictates how much energy is going to be required. The amount of intensity you bring, so how hard are you going to be working, will dictate whether or not that energy comes from carbohydrate or fat. So if you're working for, let's say, an ultramarathon, but you're doing the ultramarathon and you're just kind of going to make it to the finish line, so you're just kind of cruising through, you might be walking part of that, jogging a little bit of it, but you're kind of just toughing it out to get through to the end, right? For the most part, you're probably burning fat with a little bit of carbohydrate. And that's because the intensity is on the low end of the intensity spectrum, you'll burn fat. High end of the intensity spectrum, you'll burn carbohydrate, relatively. Hyrox is going to be in 60 to 90 minutes, as we've said, but at high intensity. So you're going to be moving with your heart rate somewhere around kind of probably 80 to 90% of your max heart rate.
I've seen a lot of them pull up their chart, and it's like
red.
Yeah, red the whole way, like 185, and they're like, geez. Like.
So if you think, if you do wear a heart rate monitor or a watch, you're essentially sitting in zone 4, zone 5 that whole time. And so that's an hour to 2 hours in red zone, working at near maximal capacity.
It's funny too because they try to use the run to bring them out bring the heart rate down, which is quite funny because they're running like 4-minute Ks and trying to bring their heart rate down to.
But that's where the whole training element comes in, and I think where most people kind of get the race a little bit mixed up, because these guys they might be running 4-minute Ks, but they can run 3-minute Ks. So they'd be like you, if you can run a 5-minute K, you're probably then running a 6-minute K. Yeah,
just to gather yourself.
Yeah, correct. So the relative, that's what's crazy when you look at the actual race. But when you look at that, so up to about an hour to an hour and a half, we can fuel with the carbohydrate that we've got stored on our body, right? So if you just eat normally beforehand or day to day, you could probably sustain about 60 to 90 minutes depending on where you fall on that spectrum of intensity.
Would that, that's what I was going to ask, the intensity. Does that mean, because if you're at, level 5, does that pull the carbs out quicker?
Yeah.
Or so would you essentially have to, because with that, the Hyrox, it is pretty much like they're redlining the whole way.
Yep.
And whereas if I was to run, when I was doing that half marathon prep, I would be zone 3, zone 4.
Yep.
And then fueling was around an hour, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
So if you think about, like, I tend to use like a water bottle as an analogy.
Yeah.
The water bottle in this case, with the water filled up, is the muscle with the amount of carbohydrate that you've got stored. So you store carbohydrate in the muscle. So whenever you go to exercise, you use the carbohydrate that's actually stored in your muscle.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I've got the water bottle, it's full. Now in zone 2, if it's full and you've tilted the bottle a little bit, you'll get some water spilling out, but it's not going to be a hell of a lot. In zone 2 and below, you're essentially conserving carbohydrate. So you're not using the fuel that's in the water bottle, right? Not using carbohydrate that's in the muscle that much.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you go to zone 3, you're tipping it a bit more, but it's about half and half.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're in zone 3, you're kind of getting about a mix between energies coming from carbohydrate, energies coming from fat. As soon as you go above zone 3 and you start hitting the high end zone 3 and zone 4, now you're turning the bottle upside down.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and at that point, you're pretty much switching solely to carbohydrate burn. Mm-hmm. There's a little bit of fat, but very minimal.
Yeah.
And so now you're burning carbohydrate. But like with the water bottle, now that you're just tipping that water bottle upside down, there's a time ticker that's going to take for you to empty that water bottle completely.
Mm.
And so typically, if you've given yourself about an hour to an hour and a half, depending on whether or not you're given a couple of little pumps to really empty the bottle or not,
Yeah.
that's roughly how long it's going to take before you kind of start hitting the red light kind of comes on the car where you got the empty.
Yeah.
And the body's like, yeah, okay, bro, you got to either slow down or get some fuel in because we ain't sustaining this. and so Hyrox really fits right into that bracket.
Yeah.
It's on the cusp of realistically how long you can actually sustain high intensity for, depending on your level of fitness and depending on how hard you go. Mm-hmm. And I'd say for most people that are kind of realistically going to get closer to the hour and a half, carbohydrate really will be the limiting factor.
Yeah.
Because at that point, you're going a little bit beyond what you probably should, both in terms of intensity, because realistically, if it's going to take you an hour and a half, you don't have the fitness capacity as the person that's going to take less than an hour. Mm. So your heart rate relatively is going to be a little bit higher, which means you're burning more carbohydrate per minute, but for an extended period of time. Yeah. So now for an extra 30 minutes on top of what they would be burning it at.
Yeah, and also like to make a note, you got to get your fuel in before you run out as well. Like I remember I took my refuel when I was doing my run, and I did it on the hour. When I remember you specifically telling me you need to do it 15 minutes before, even if you feel all right, because that's when the fuel is going to hit E. Versus I went to E and then tried to run for another 15 minutes waiting for the fuel to get into the system.
And that's mainly because it has to pass through the gut first. So it doesn't just go straight from mouth to blood. It goes mouth and then it goes through the digestive system. Once it hits the digestive system, which takes time, like it's fast because it's liquid, if you're taking liquid, but it still takes time. And so by the time it comes from you've swallowed it, gets to the gut, from the gut, it kind of just dissolves into the bloodstream. And now it's in a position where it can be used. But even when it's in the bloodstream, you then still have to get it into the muscle and activate it. So you still have to kind of turn it on. I
also want to make a note for the listeners. If you're thinking of doing a Hyrox, from the mental side of things, you need to understand that you're going to push harder than you thought you would. If you're going to be competing, you probably have been training and you think that your window's over here and you need to get that refeed in at X, it's probably going to be sooner because humans are competitive. When we're surrounded by other people going, it's motivating. You push harder than you ever been. That's why most records are always on the competitive field. Like everyone has PBs outside of things, but they tend to always PB in competition because you're ramping up, but then also just having that competitiveness. So you're probably going to blow your tank out even quicker.
Well, I mean, and adrenaline. So if you think of adrenaline, adrenaline of the day. So even when you wake up in the morning, we talked about heart rate variability, but your heart rate is going to be higher in the morning, the day of competition, compared to what it normally is. So right from the get-go, you're probably burning more carbohydrate per minute. And you haven't even done anything yet. Now you're warming up and you're probably in zone 3. And again, you're just burning
That's
more carbohydrate
that's a good point, actually. Yeah,
per minute without doing anything. And so, correct, if you're not taking that into account, you're probably starting with a half full tank or a 3/4 full tank as opposed to a full tank. And so then if you start ramping it up, and again, if you're in training, it might take you 15 minutes to get your heart rate up to 170 beats per minute. But when you're racing, it probably takes you a couple of minutes because it's already sitting at 160 before you're outside of the blocks. And so right from the get-go, you're burning it faster. There isn't anything you could probably do in training other than do another race that will prepare you for a race. Yeah. So you almost just have to take it into account.
Yeah.
And
try to keep that in the back of your mind, like a little bit extra fuel, maybe a little bit earlier than what you would think based on previous trainings. Yeah. Pretty
much. And the good thing is that for most people, carbohydrate utilization it's not the same, but the amount that we can actually uptake through ingestion is very similar. So let's say you're a faster carb burner than me. So if we tested us, if we both did like a lactate test and we had a substrate utilization test, so we're breathing into a mask, it might come back that you burn through more carbohydrate per hour than what I do, let's say, right? Or vice versa.
Yeah.
That means typically, yes, you are kind of tipping your water bottle up a lot harder or a lot further than what I'm tipping mine. But we've both faced the same barrier in that the transporter that actually gets the carbohydrate from the gut into the system is maxed out at about, I think it ends up being about 60 grams an hour.
Oh, yeah.
So regardless of how much carbs you would burn in an hour, you're limited by the amount of carbohydrate that you can ingest in an hour.
That's interesting.
So you might burn through twice the amount of carbs that I burn through, but yet we both have the same amount of uptake capacity.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's why those ultra marathon runners, like, they're just so damn good at just holding onto their carbs for fuel. Versus like you can feed yourself as much as you want. That's what is it Ross Edgley? Yeah, the swimmer. He's like, I'm not even a swimmer. I'm just a really good eater. Like, it's funny that he says that because he gets out of the water, eats his food, just jumps in and he can digest it really well, and he just keeps going and keeps going.
And that's exactly it. And it's so, again, once we look at kind of Hyrox, it's about 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour, and that's after the first hour. Okay, so technically for that first hour of exercise, you should be able to get in enough carbohydrate from your normal diet or what you eat prior to the event. You should be able to get that in. But then if you're going to, so unless you're one of those pros that goes under an hour, you then technically fit into the next bracket. In that you need about 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour after that. So if it's a 90-minute, you're going to take around about 90 minutes. It's probably about 30 grams of additional carbohydrate that you would need throughout the race.
For an hour and a half,
for an hour and a half. Anything over about an hour to an hour 15, I would just take the extra 30 grams of carbs. If you think that it's going to take you 2 hours and you're still going to be pushing at a relative intensity, then again, I'd bump that up to 60 grams for the hour, so 30 grams every half an hour.
Okay, cool. So 60 grams every hour.
60 grams every
30
hour.
And then would you want to fuel that 15 minutes before the hour?
Yeah. So
and then for that last half an hour, would you do that so you do it at 45 minutes and an hour 15? Is that sort of what you'd probably be thinking?
It's probably safe to. It's probably safe to. Again, this is where training with it actually kind of comes in handy. So rather than, I'd never go to, whether it's a running race, whether it's a Hyrox, whether it's a triathlon, anything. Don't just hear the information and chuck it in on race day. Train it.
You got to train your gut.
You got to train it. So
that was going to be my next path anyway. So
so in that case, I would probably have the carbohydrate. If I know it's going to take me an hour and a half, I would start fueling at about the 45-minute mark, which will then get me to the hour, and then I'd go every half an hour after that first ingestion. So if you play it out far enough, you're essentially getting 60 to 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour of exercise after the first hour.
Yeah.
If you start at the 45 and work in half-hour blocks after that.
Yeah.
Right? So that's my personal timing.
Yeah.
That's kind of my blanket start there. After that, then it's all about just trial and error. And so depending on the person, we might actually start at 30 minutes because maybe they just find they're a high carb burner and they're burning through those carbohydrates quite quickly. Vice versa, it might be an hour, and that's because they're actually not moving at nearly as high intensity as what we originally thought. So they don't actually need that much fuel because there's some of that's coming from fat.
Can you change, like, being a high carb burner? Is it the fitter you get, typically the less carbs you'll burn? Or?
Yes, essentially. So when you're more efficient, you'll be using more fat as an energy source, and we all burn fat. So if we're resting, most of us, unless we're diabetic, will be burning fat at rest, right? So if you're a diabetic, then typically you'll be burning carb at rest because you'll always have glucose in your bloodstream. But for general population, at rest you should be burning majority, not all, but majority fat. You're always going to have a little bit of each.
Okay.
But typically at rest, the majority of it will come from fat. As you start to increase the intensity, so let's say we're sitting up now, okay, you'll be burning a little bit less, a little bit more carb, all the way up until you're running.
Yeah.
Or all the way up until you're sprinting.
Yeah, slowly tipping the scale.
You'll slowly tip the scale. Yeah. The fitter you are, the slower that scale tips. Right? So you can now work at a faster rate. So the 4 minute per K that you brought up earlier, they might be able to run at 4 minutes per kilometer while burning 50-50. So they're still burning fat and only a little bit of carbohydrate.
Yeah. I saw a video, someone was like, no one told me that I would burn 300 calories running 5Ks, and then 4 months later I'm burning 180. And then it's like, no one told me that because I kept eating that, because they got fitter. And then it's essentially, yes, you have to. Well, because normally you would probably be dropping a bit of weight too, right? If your time goes down as well, sort of thing. It's just the body adapts, right?
Yep. And so again, it does change, and ideally the fitter you are, the longer you can kind of keep into that fat burning zone, or just burning fat and preserving carbohydrate, which is kind of the name of the game.
Yep.
But at an intensity sport, so Hyrox being an intensity sport, it's a race. It's not like a marathon or an ultra marathon where the goal is to kind of just cross the line.
Yep.
So most people aren't going to be working in zone 2, zone 3.
Yeah.
You're pretty much always going to be zone 4, zone 5, and that's purely because you're treating it like a race.
Yeah.
Which means, again, if you're pretty much everyone from the start will be burning carbohydrate. There might be 1 or 2 people in the whole mix of the crowd that will kind of just eventually get to the line.
Yeah.
But for the most part, you could almost guarantee everyone's going to be in that race format. And so most of us are going to be burning carbohydrate essentially from the get-go.
Yeah, well, we're competitive beings, right?
100%.
We're not there to beat others. We're there to set our PB time or whatnot.
Exactly.
So we talked about training and that nutrition. Talk about actually your nutrition, what it should be like when you're going through the training block. I'm guessing you would have when you sat with your Hyrox athletes, that would have been probably majority of the conversation, right? Is prepping for it and making sure you're getting enough fuel.
Correct.
Yeah.
So there's 2 different ways to kind of go about it, and they both go simultaneously. So we train to support general fuel availability or energy availability, which is having enough calories, specifically enough carbohydrate, to meet the demands of your training in general. So if we just look at your training across the week, how much general calories and carbohydrates are we needing? For anyone doing any type of endurance activity, it'll be somewhere in the ballpark of kind of 4 to 8 grams per kilo of carbohydrates. So if you weigh 100 kilos, it will be 400 to 800 grams of carbohydrates per day. 50 kilos, whatever they are, 200 to 500 grams of carbohydrates per day. Okay, so depending on your weight, that kind of gives you at least a starting point of how many carbohydrates you should be getting in for that type of exercise.
Yep.
And then we want to find a way that's actually going to be manageable, because that's a fuck ton of carbohydrate for everyone who's actually tried to eat that much carbohydrate.
Yeah.
trying to find a manageable way for you to get that in on each day.
Yeah.
So I tend to not worry too much about what you're doing day to day. We'll just take your general training as, hey, this is your fuel requirement.
Yeah.
So if you're not doing a lot today, we want to get in the same amount of carbohydrate because you are going to do something tomorrow, and we want to make sure you've got enough fuel so that you can do something tomorrow. So we're just looking at the general fuel requirements across the week. How can we get 4 to 8 grams per kilo every day throughout the week? That's kind of base strategy number one. Move to the next one is there a simulation or is there a race-specific workout that you're doing either this week or in the month or wherever that falls, that we can strategize actually what we need to eat throughout that event.
Yeah.
Right. So if that training session is going to take you an hour and a half, or you're doing, most Hyroxes will be doing also, or if you're not, do a long run.
Yeah.
Because that's probably the one thing you can do each week. That will be a minimum of 90 minutes.
Yeah.
That will also not necessarily just make you race each week.
Yeah.
So if you're always racing, you'll never kind of improve your capacity because you're just maxing out every time. So, whereas we want to train the ability to max out.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
just getting your muscles used to
working for
longer
that period of time.
Yeah.
Yep. So whether it's the long run, whether it's a race simulation or whatever, whenever those come in, that's where we can actually train the gut to fuel during. So again, ideally, we've got something coming in pre. I like to work in about 2 hours and 30 minutes. So as we go into that specific session, what do you eat 90 minutes to 2 hours before that session? And then what do you eat 30 minutes before that session? So break that down on both ends, and then we can figure out what you need to be eating during that race. And like I said, once we figure out what the time is, it's about 60 grams per hour during. But we can take that same 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour and just plug it in beforehand too. So if we know we can only kind of uptake around 60 grams of carbs purely from glucose, you can play with that, but let's just keep it simple for now. You can get around about 60 grams of carbohydrates coming in before. If you're eating 2 hours before, that's roughly around 60 to 120 grams of carbohydrates that you want to be having at the 2 hour mark.
Yeah.
Right? If you can't stomach the full 120, I'd probably go closer to 60 to 90 2 hours out, and then at 30 minutes out, have another 30 to 60. Right? So you're kind of just breaking it down to make it a bit easier for the stomach.
Yeah.
Something 2 hours out will be more of just like a carbohydrate-rich but more dense meal. So, I don't know, banana and honey on toast, cereal, things like that.
Yep.
Versus, say, 30 minutes out, you want something that's going to be easy to digest. So for me, it's always like carbohydrate drinks or gels.
Yeah.
You can have honey off the spoon. I've been doing that recently.
Yep.
But something simple and it's just very quick and easy.
Yeah, cool.
So I would just do that on the days that you're kind of strategizing either a long run, so you're training the gut to be used to consuming food before you exercise, and during those race simulations just to kind of see where you fit, how is my energy holding up throughout the entirety of this process.
And what's recovery like? How do you give your guys recovery advice? Like what is the conversation there?
So again, very similar to the fuel requirements. So I'd break it down into 2 phases. So one, we just look at the general base, and the general base is part of that recovery is, are you getting enough carbohydrate in? Because obviously carbohydrate is the fuel that you need to recover from.
Yeah.
So as long as we're getting enough carbohydrate in throughout the day, every day, the energy will be there for them to be able to recover. And then also kind of falls back to the protein sense, right? So are we getting enough protein on a general day-to-day basis? Again, to meet the requirements. So if we go up to, there'll be some kind of resistance training, anywhere between 1.6 and probably 2 grams per kilo. Now, if you're pushing the carbs high, so if you're going 6 to 8 grams per kilo, I would probably drop the protein down to like 1.6. So if you go high carb, go slightly lower on the protein.
Okay.
If you're going lower carb, go slightly higher on the protein. And that's mainly because carbs are protein sparing.
Yeah.
Meaning if your body is using carbs for energy, it's not going to use protein for energy.
Yeah.
Right? So you don't need as much protein if you've got carbohydrate.
Gotcha.
And if you bump both of those up, it kind of leaves no room for fat, or you're going to be in a surplus. and then you'll be gaining weight throughout that process, which is not great for endurance performance.
Yeah. Definitely not ideal.
Definitely not. But from a protein sense, again, we kind of just want to make sure you're getting in enough, so somewhere between 1.6 to 2 grams per kilo throughout the day.
And would you be scheduling in like days off or like
from a training sense?
Yeah, from a training sense for these guys doing those Hyrox exercises?
I would say everyone probably should have like the rest thrown in there.
Yeah.
And I think this is the difference between. So if you're training to exercise, so if I think back to when I was bodybuilding, and you could extrapolate that to how most people kind of go about normal like gym classes. So if you think of BFT or F45, right? They'll turn up and just do as many classes as they can because one, they want to get their money's worth, but two, it's like it's a part of their identity.
Yep.
It's just being a part of that class.
Yeah.
Same as me when I was bodybuilding. You know, it's like realistically, I could go and train arms on a Saturday if I've trained legs the day before. Like, and I'm not going to burn myself out by going and pumping a couple of sets of bicep curls.
Yeah.
Like, it's not overly taxing. The difference when it comes to training for a race is that you should be training to tax a system rather than just training to train.
Yeah.
And so there's likely going to be 2 to 3 key sessions throughout the week where you're really trying to turn up for.
Yeah.
And so I just put out a post last week about like how there was like a study done in racehorses back in the day.
Yeah.
And what they found is when you pushed the racehorses harder on hard days, so kept the easy days and the recovery days the same, but pushed the racehorses harder on the hard days, they improved their race performance.
Yeah.
So they got faster. However, when you kept the hard days the same, so kept the hard days or tried to keep the hard days hard and pushed the intensity on the easy days, so made the easy days moderate to hard, the racehorses actually got slower. And that's because they just don't have enough recovery capacity.
Yeah.
You're essentially overtraining or overreaching too far.
Yeah, and then you open yourself up to injury. And I definitely fell victim to that myself, you know. And we all make mistakes.
100%.
You know, and it's a learning curve for everyone.
100%. And it's, you know, again, I think a lot of like, if you look at the professional athletes, they probably don't take too many rest days. Yeah. Like complete rest days.
Yeah, active rest days pretty much.
But they do respect their recovery days. And their recovery days might be equivalent to you going for a walk. Yeah. You know, so like, yeah, sure, they're still running and they're still moving. But if you take into context what their hard looks like and their actual physical capacity, that might be the same stress as you going for a walk for an hour. So their running for an hour would be the same as you walking for an hour.
Yeah, because they can run for 40 hours.
Right? So again, it's all relative. So for most people, I would probably think like it's actually probably better just to take either 1 or 2 rest days. Yeah. Or really respect the recovery days, but in doing so, you know, pay attention to how hard you're working during those recovery days. Yeah. And you really want to make your easy days easy and your hard days hard, rather than just try to be hard across the week. Yeah, yeah. But to do that, again, like I said, you want the fuel coming in all the time, so that when you think of the water bottle again, right? So if we're getting the same amount of carbohydrate on a rest day, you're actually able to fill up that water bottle. The hard days are depleting the water, so we're going from full to 3/4 to half to a quarter. But you have the recovery days, you have the same amount of carbohydrate coming in, you're going from a quarter to half to 3/4. So without it, you won't be able to get the fuel back into the system and actually aid that recovery process.
Yeah, so when are we doing a Hyrox race?
When are we doing a Hyrox race? Yeah. I don't even know when it's coming back.
Yeah, hard out. I reckon we should do it. It would at least be 6 months to 9 months away. Yeah. You know, like I think...
I've been practicing my running. I need to practice my sleds.
Yeah, I've not been doing any of it, but my legs are feeling good. Yep. Like I'm finally, knock on wood, I'm back on extensions. I'm doing hex squats again. Nice. So finally the knees are actually, I don't want to jinx it, but I don't want to go back running too soon, but I might throw in a slow like 7-minute K bloody run, like 5K or something like that on a treadmill. Yep. Just to introduce it back in, because I definitely I can feel a bit more puffed than I did before. You know, We won't talk about when I'm feeling puffed, but definitely noticing the old
stamina.
The stamina's not there, my bro. Awesome. All right. Well, I guess we could leave it at that.
We'll leave it there.
Cool.
Cheers,
Thanks
guys.
for listening, guys. Cheers.